tierra donde todos somos como hermanos, así es Medellín. Medellín, flor de primavera, eres la primera, lo puedo decir. Mi Medellín, Medellín, brillante lucero, tu nombre llegó al mundo entero. Medellín, brillante lucero, tu nombre llegó al mundo entero. Ay, qué feliz me siento cuando escucho a mi gente contar remembranzas que no olvidarán, forman parte de su identidad. Medellín, qué hermoso tú eres, todas tus mujeres son dignas de ti. Medellín, si lejos me encuentro, mi corazón decidió.
So good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to day 2 of our World Circular Economy Forum, coming here from sunny Helsinki, just with the briefest of downpours designed to wake us all up. Welcome to all of you also who are viewing this session on the webcast. It's great to have you all with us. Goodness me, we had great conversations yesterday. The whole challenge is not whether circular economy, but it's how. How do we scale up? How do we get those impactful investments? How do we ensure a globally fair and just evolution? And how do we put in place those progressive governance systems that will enable that transition to circular economy? We're going straight in this morning with this plenary session looking at the issue of international trade of circular economy goods and services, and I'm delighted to be joined this morning by Eliza Nyangwe, who is a co-moderator, very much involved in issues of world trade. So we're going to have the fun of having some conversation with some really interesting speakers. But Eliza, maybe you just want to frame a little bit of the conversation we're going to have.
Sure, thank you, and good morning to you all. It's really great to see you because this is definitely stay in bed weather. We think the Finns have tried to make us Brits feel very at home with some rain. Don't you feel welcome? So, as we've already had a little bit of the framing from yesterday, just to pick up on what we're looking at today, of course, our morning session is entitled International Trade of Circular Economy Goods and Services, and breathe. That's going to mean in a very packed session is that we are going to be talking about what does it actually look like to trade in the goods and services that many of you are in the business of providing. As you are pioneers, this is a pioneering area of trade policy as well. But just to remind you, of course, as you know, trade in goods and services is ancient, right? People have been trading in all sorts of things going back 3,000 years BC. What we have now, though, is a trade system that many say is in need of reform for traditional goods and services, let alone goods and services from the circular economy, and as well as that, a political system in a lot of countries that is looking more at protectionist trade policies. So how do we slip circular economy into all of that? We have lots of speakers to speak to you about that, but perhaps, Peter, you want to kick us off with our first.
Well, we thought we would try and offer an overview of world trade and the circular economy in 8 minutes. Is it possible? Probably not, but we're delighted that we have Anthony Cox with us, who's Deputy Director at the Environment Directorate of the OECD, huge experience in this area with the invidious task, but hopefully one to stimulate our sense about that international trade. So to offer us that overview, please welcome to the platform Anthony Cox. Should we just go over there for the first one? Good luck.
Thank you very much, Peter and Eliza, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So yesterday we heard a lot about, let's get this going first. We heard a lot about various important aspects of the circular economy transition, around new business models, about the role of innovation, about pricing, about inclusiveness, and so on. But throughout the day, I really didn't hear too much about the role of trade. And this is a bit disturbing because trade is one of the most challenging and gnarliest topics that is going to affect the ability of the world to move towards a more circular economy. It'll dramatically affect the cost and the ease with which we can make that transition. One of the things that is clear is that global value chains are just that. They are global. And if we are to reap the benefits of a transition to a circular economy, we really need to be able to efficiently move goods and services around the world. In fact, the concept that underpins trade, comparative advantage, is actually at the heart of the circular economy story. We want to make the most efficient use of our resources. And we want to do that in a heavily globalized world. But comparative advantage requires that we take into account the environmental consequences of our actions. Trade clearly brings huge benefits in terms of development, in terms of jobs, in terms of bringing people out of poverty. But increased trade and these benefits should not come at the expense of the environment. So a question that I hope frames this panel today is, are our trade policies, is our trade regime fit for purpose in a circular economy world? And I hope that we tease out that question today. Anyone who doubts the importance of the linkages between trade and the environment only needs to have a look at the ban by China on imports of plastic waste and scrap. As you know, the ban was announced in 2017 and then took place since then. And we've seen imports or exports of plastic waste and scrap to China and to Hong Kong, China, just fall away dramatically. Now, export or import bans of this type are normally seen as the last resort for any good trade economist. They come with a host of technical, legal, and economic issues that I don't want to go into here. But what is clear is that this ban has kick-started serious work in countries as they scramble to figure out what to do with the piles of plastic waste that is building up in their countries and in their facilities. It is forcing countries to dramatically rethink the way in which they are dealing with their plastic waste, from sustainable design through to reducing use and increasing recycling and reuse. But it has also driven up the costs of domestic recycling. It is forcing investments in the construction of domestic recycling facilities that may or may not be the most efficient way of addressing and treating waste. So, has this ban generated serious debate about the role of trade? I think it's starting to. I think it's starting to get to the issue of what do we want our trade regime to do in a circular economy? And that's what we'll address today. The issue of trade becomes even more stark when you look to the future. Last year, the OECD released its Global Materials Outlook to 2050, where we projected that in the absence of policy change, materials use will more than double out to 2060. And this will be driven by a combination of the cumulative effects of economic growth, of structural change, of technological change. And this will drive this change. And it'll be distributed differently, around the world. And with the BRICS and the rest of the world being the leaders in terms of the impacts, the growth in this materials use. And trade will underpin this. Trade will be a core part of this. We also know that the environmental consequences of this increased growth in materials use will have will be significant. We know that greenhouse gas emissions related to materials management will more than double by 2060. And this is perhaps not surprising when you consider that around 12% of total greenhouse gas emissions come from just 7 key metals, 12% come from emissions associated with concrete, and there's around 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalent that is associated with the materials cycle. So how is this all going to be reflected in the linkages between trade and circular economy? How should we be framing this? So we've developed a schematic to try and pin down the issues, to highlight the key issues that we need to address. Clearly, along the value chain, there are policies that are going to affect the degree to which a value chain is encompassed in the circular economy. And these policies are generally developed at the national level. They're developed within national boundaries. But the circular economy transition will have significant implications for trade. For example, through trade in second-hand goods, goods for refurbishment and remanufacturing, waste for recovery, and so on and so forth. And then we start to see, okay, where do the policy pressure points occur? These are around there's the actual trade itself. There's the policy alignment between trade policies and circular economy policies. And there's the level of international cooperation on key factors that will increase the fluidity of that trade around things that will set the agenda that we need to address for trade and the circular economy. It is clear that international trade flows will change as a result of a transition to a circular economy. It'll create opportunities for increasing resource efficiency through comparative advantage. But to facilitate this, we need to avoid trade barriers that, to the extent possible. We need to build domestic capacity to effectively work with the trade rules that will also lead to environmental outcomes that we can live with. And there may need to be a form of managed trade that we need to use the existing trade policies to enhance, trade policy tools to enhance. For example, the Basel Convention recently brought plastic waste into its remit. It's the recent Conference of Parties that adopted a decision that would bring plastic waste under the Basel Convention rules. And this is a significant step using the existing trade rules. So going forward, we need to have a serious effort to develop agreed international standards and mutual recognition on a range of key issues such as material content, hazardous content, recyclability, repairability, that are currently not really in place in the global trading system. We need a serious effort to avoid a multiplicity of standards and a multiplicity of agreements to ease and facilitate trade. We also need in this agenda to do much more work on data availability, data transparency, data definition, classification of waste. What is waste? What is a hazardous waste? There is a lot of work that needs to be done. There's a whole agenda there that groups such as the OECD, WTO need to engage in. Let me finish up with some brief insights from some work that we are just about to release at OECD, where we did a policy experiment based on our modelling work that out to 2040 in this case, where we imposed a materials tax and then we redistributed the revenue from that materials tax to subsidies into recycling and to lower labour taxes. It was a budget-neutral policy experiment. Dramatically had an impact on resource use, on the circular economy, reduced the use of these materials, of aluminium, of copper, and so on and so forth, quite dramatically. And this is driven through efficiency gains, through scaling up production or scaling down production, and through trade. Trade is the glue, is the oil that will help us make the circular economy transition feasible. The big challenge for us is that we are increasingly living in a world where countries are starting to disappear behind national boundaries. And this is not a viable or sustainable way forward. We want to make sure that we address the inherent tension between trade policies and circular economy policies, and make sure that trade policy works for circular economy and not against it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks there. Such an in-depth view, Anthony. Thank you. For the layperson, the non-trade expert, in one sentence, I guess what Anthony was saying is the circular economy will change trade. So let's delve a little deeper into the question of how that will happen. How do we do so, and achieve fair trade in the materials, goods, and services related to the circular economy? What are those related mechanisms? To talk about these, we'll invite up our first two speakers, who will each have just 5 minutes to give us their perspective, and then Peter and I will put some questions to them. So please welcome up, speaking from the Environment and Natural Resources Global Practice at the World Bank, Karen Kemper, and the Director of Planning and Budget Office at the Presidency of the Oriental Republic of Uruguay, Alvaro Garcia. Welcome to you both. So those mechanisms are financing, standards, taxation, and subsidies. Karen, would you like to take us through that first?
Thank you very much, Eliza. At the World Bank, we are very strong supporters of the circular economy approach. That's why we are here. And we get at the circular economy from an angle of looking at how can we help reduce poverty in the world and how can we bring about prosperity. And as we've been discussing since yesterday, of course, the linear economy apparently used to bring us exactly there. But now, as we look at how our natural capital is undermined, our natural assets, and how that is basically taking the foundation of our joint house, Earth, we need to look at circular economy approaches and how to precisely, more efficiently use materials and bring them back and not just try to get rid of them. So for that, I'd like to offer a few considerations then on the what it means in the context of trade. One is that we really need to get the pricing right. We've heard since yesterday a bit about the issue of subsidies. There's about $5 trillion a year globally of subsidies on fossil fuels. As you can imagine, that has a lot of distorting and profound effects. On the one hand, it makes things really cheap, like the famous plastic bags, very, very cheap, both to produce, to ship to somewhere, to use for some average of 20 seconds, and then discard, or what we used to think was discarding them. That is one part. Subsidies on fossil fuels also make shipping very cheap. We'll have our World Development Report coming out very soon on global value chains, and that is one of the arguments. If shipping is so cheap, then it has an impact on the way we do trade and produce new products and how we ship them around. So certainly something to keep in mind in terms of pricing. Now, one issue I'd like to pose there, though, is when countries try national subsidy reform, they have a competitiveness issue. Because they may think that if I take away the subsidies, then my products are going to become more expensive, and I can't afford that in a global economy. And that is the discussion we need to have. How can countries work together to get rid of certain types of subsidies so they don't have that skewed effect, because probably their citizens wouldn't like that. The other point I want to make is that we need harmonized product standards. if we want to trade in products that are cleaner, that have a better impact on the environment. Of course, on the first hand, we need to get rid of the toxins that are in certain products that we should do anyway, even if we don't try to trade them. And there's a lot of countries that have regulations on that. But at the same time, a lot of developing countries need support to develop the institutional setup in order to drive such things through. So for instance, we have been working with Laos to phase out lead in toys and in paints. You may say, well, that is a nice thing for Laos internally, but it also means that maybe toys that get produced in Laos can then be exported to countries where lead cannot be in the toys. So there is a trade aspect to how products are produced and how we bring standardization and harmonization. And one of the things we need to take into account is it's not enough if one country has a regulation, it needs to be multiple countries. So again, we need international cooperation because so many products today are produced in components where each component is produced in a different country. That's where the global value chains come in, and that all needs to fit together. So there's a lot to do. And the last point I want to make is that in the transition to a circular economy, one could imagine that there might be a slowdown in trade of primary materials, and that we might have more of an increase in second-hand materials and in end-of-life cycle materials. And that will be a big shift both in how we do that, and Anthony alluded to that a bit in the OECD report, but also we have to look at what does it mean for inclusion and for jobs in those countries that now are dependent on the primary materials, because sometimes jobs don't materialize in the same place where you lost them. And we know that it's developing countries that supply a lot of the primary materials. What would it mean for them to shift their economies? So I think I leave it there for the continued discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, that's quite an agenda for discussion, and interesting. What seems to be the logical thing to do works within a political framework. So I think we'll be opening up some of those tensions and issues about that transition. But it'd be great to bring in Alvaro Garcia from Uruguay, advising the presidency on its work related to trade, etc. And it's really helpful to have a reality check of a nation that is an emerging trading nation and dealing with some of the issues and tensions of understanding circular economy, and then joining a larger international trading system. So great to have you with us, and interested to hear one or two of your reflections on how circular economy is embedding within Uruguay.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I'm going to start giving you some information about Uruguay and about circular economy in my country. Uruguay is a small country between Argentina and Brazil in South America. We are 3.5 million people. We have $16,000 of GDP per capita. We have the best income distribution in Latin America. And our main brand is Uruguay Natural from many years ago. We have a strong commitment with the SDGs, the 2030 agenda, and we have a very good indicators in water. In fact, almost 100% of the population has drinkable water. For many years ago, we have good indicators in renewable energies. We have almost 100% of electrical generation each day coming from the renewable energies. We have a plan of management and use of soils in order to order the crops. And we are not so good in treatment of waste. In fact, we have to improve a lot in this. We have a bill in Parliament like today. We start with the circular economy in 2014. We create a program called BioValor, a project of 3 ministries: Ministries of Industry, Energy and Mining, Ministry of Environment, and Ministry of Livestock, Agriculture and Fisheries. But in 2017, months after the first World Circular Economy Forum, we create the first forum in Latin America in Uruguay, 2017. It was really an important thing, and well, I took part of them, and people of Ellen MacArthur Foundation, I remember, and was a really important step in order to incorporate the circular economy idea in our economy and in our society. In the same, in 17 Uruguay be part of the Partnership for Action on Green Economy PAGE initiative of the United Nations, and this collaborate with our vision Uruguay 2050, that is our national development strategy. We have a program called Circular Opportunities by our National Development Agency and BioValor. And tomorrow, World Environment Day, we will deliver the first Circular Economy National Award in Uruguay. This is really important because we work with a system called Transform Uruguay, that is a joint between the sector public and the private, the public sector and the private sector. Well, my main message today, talking about circular economy and trade, international trade, is the following. Trade could be a key factor for circular economy. I don't imagine any development of circular economy without the international trade. As someone said yesterday, trade is fundamental for small countries. In fact, Uruguay needs that. So it's really important that all countries come together in this challenge, including, of course, the bigger economies. Uruguay is a historical supporter of multilateralism. You remember the Uruguay round of World Trade Organization. And so we strongly believe that circular economy could be, or better, must be, the factor that impulses the multilateralism again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Perhaps I can start with you, Karen. There was a lot in what you said where you talked about standards and the need for multilateralism. So we had heard that a little bit in Anthony's opening remarks, this phrase, fit for purpose. There is great doubt about whether our institutions at the moment are fit for purpose, and no country wants to take the risks, as you pointed out, to go it alone. How do we start to make headway in using our the institutions that exist to get the kinds of change that we need for the circular economy to become more mainstream?
Well, I think that there's a range of opportunities at the moment. I'm originally from the water resources sector, and it's very hard to move things on water resources, and so we say never let a good drought pass by in order to get change. And I think that the current drought that we have, in a way, is when China decided to not take waste and plastics anymore, which caught most other countries very much off guard. And in a way, China has created a great opportunity to start tackling something that in a way was hidden, where a lot of countries thought that they were actually recycling when they were not. And people were putting things in their yellow bags and blue bins and whatever nice colors that one has overall in the Western world. And then in the end, it was actually shipped away. Now countries have to deal with it. So I think that this is the type of drought, the type of crisis, as a lot of the neatly stacked recyclables are sitting in harbors and in recycling plants, and where countries need to think, so what do we do? Because it's not something that is going away, and we need to take care of it. And where countries are starting to come together. And I think that is where, for instance, the discussion about standards come in, and maybe it's not necessarily the traditional institutions that start the discussions at a very high level, but it's a combination of partnerships of the private sector and public institutions such as the World Bank or the WTO or the OECD or other organizations that come together and say, well, what kinds of standards would we need to have? Would we, for instance, should we help drive a standard where you have only 4 or 5 types of plastic that then makes it much easier to recycle than if you can have any type of number of plastics, where most of it is so expensive to categorize and have different processes for that, especially developing countries can't deal with it. But as we now know, industrial countries don't either. It's not been worth it doing it for them. So I think it's actually more a collective of multiple institutions than just one big institution going in and doing it.
So if I may follow up, you talked about making sure that we kept in mind the developing countries, because of course we know that standards can be used as non-tariff barriers to the poorer nations, and in the title of this session the words fair trade are in there. So how do we ensure that whatever standards we get, we have the developing countries at the table as they're being set?
Yeah, I think that is absolutely fundamental. It cannot be something that is just developed in one part of the world, but developing countries are very proactive. For instance, ASEAN countries have come together. They have issued a plastics charter, and actually in part it is even driven by developing countries to certainly not only be at the table, but actually pushing the table. And I agree with you that we really need to make sure that global dialogue continues.
I just wonder, Alvaro, whether you have a particular perspective related to the journey towards harmonized standards.
Yes, I agree completely. Karen is very clear about that. And when I talk about multilateralism, I think that my country alone can do anything. But with all the rest of the small countries and all the countries together with the bigger economies, well, it's a hard challenge, but we need to go ahead, because it will be very difficult to advance in sustainable development and in circular economy without these agreements.
Alvaro, you were talking to us from your own national perspective, and it's really interesting that actually when we talk about circular economy, you mentioned multiple ministries. Usually projects are siloed. Is circular economy an opportunity for you to bring your ministries together to work in ways that they haven't done before? How do countries like yours start to arrange their governance so that they work for this?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, we created in 2016 innovative system in the public sector that we call Transform Uruguay. That is the joining of the union of 9 ministries related with economic topics, but with the social and environmental vision. This is a political decision level, because all the processes today are horizontal, and there is necessary the view of each ministry. And a second level with 9 agencies, mainly from the state, but with the participation of the private sector in them, each one to execute the policies. And this is very good, and sustainable development is our guide, and circular economy is one of the keys. The other one is digitalization in order to see the future. Well, we are working hard in this. It's a key factor.
Karen, one thing I wanted to draw out from you a little bit more. You put the stark figure that there is over $5 trillion, or maybe it was euros, I'm not sure, dollars, basically in subsidies for, if we call them the wrong things, or fossil fuel-based goods, etc. I mean, that's an elephant in the room. We can understand the reality why there are those subsidies, because it makes certain things competitive, it retains jobs, etc. How do we shift that elephant? Because whilstsoever you are subsidizing non-circular, it's putting out all the wrong messages. I mean, how do we begin to tackle that in a maybe a systemic way? I don't know.
Systemic would be good, but we know systemic is often complicated, especially if it were to be at a global level. But what governments are thinking about increasingly is how to, when you take away a subsidy on something, obviously that product then becomes more expensive. And citizens have counted on a certain price, be it gas you need in order to drive to work and so on. So the systemic part would then stem really from making sure that maybe there is a compensation on a different part of people's income, be it on lowering income taxes or other types of taxes, so you compensate for that, so people in the end have the same money in their pocket, but they might then choose to use the improved public transport that ideally one would have also put in place at the same time, and that way actually use fewer fossil fuels. So there's a lot of different aspects, and it will depend on the country what one can do the best way.
And would you point to any particular examples of countries who are tackling that challenge?
There are some, but they are sort of in their infancy at this moment.
Right. Okay. And I just wonder, Alvaro, a lot of this is down to politics, because if you're trying to change things, there feel as though there are winners and losers. And I'm just interested in the raw reality of politics in Uruguay, and you're a change maker, you're trying to achieve transition. Just wonder how this is playing out in the political sphere in terms of some of these big shifts in how we do trade, etc. Is it very sensitive?
We know to work a lot with political sector. That's the truth, and the organization and private sector and workers and all the society, but particularly with the political sector. I want to compliment the World Bank, because they had an initiative that is very good in order to advance. They create a coalition of finance ministers for climate action. And this is very good. I was in Chile a few weeks ago, and I turned on the TV, and I saw the finance minister of Chile talking about climate change, and very committed with the topic. And the same happened in my country. So I think that it's very important to have this kind of forums, to put these forums in other parts of the world, and to work hard in order to know more about circular economy.
Brilliant. I think we should thank our speakers for their contributions, because we have the next lot. Let's see what we can do. Please, let's thank again Alvaro and Karen for their interventions. Thank you for joining us. Peter, it felt like we could go on so much more there. There was so much more to uncover. But let's invite up our next two who will be talking to the challenges and opportunities for global trade in secondary raw materials and remanufactured goods. Who do we have?
If we could invite to the platform Annika Bresky, Executive Vice President at Storna Enso, huge pulp, paper, other forestry products company. Great to have you with us. And also Chenghua Wu, Chenghua Wu is Chief Executive Director of the Beijing Future Innovation Center, trying to think about new models, new business models, and developing the circular economy. So great to have you with us. Annika, if we start with you, in the whole kind of forestry, pulp, paper trade, you've got a long history in aspects of the circular economy. So fascinating to hear some of your insights, particularly about the evolution of that trade in secondary raw materials and remanufactured goods. I think you're doing a huge amount in that area.
Yeah, first of all, I'm very happy to be here. I'm really happy for the future to see so many faces actually committing to working towards circular economy. And I could never have imagined 20 years ago when I was a young engineer that so many people will be talking about something that in Stora Enso we've been doing for ages. So just a little background. We as a company, we are the leading provider of renewable solutions based on wood fiber for packaging, wood construction materials, biomaterials, and paper. And I think we touch the lives of many of you every single day. When you walk on the wooden floors or you use your paper cups, you read your books and magazines, you use the pulp for textile production, and so on and so forth. And for me, it's important that we touch the lives of millions of people every single day, because that is also the drive for us to disrupt our own business. And we've been doing that for more than 800 years. Parts of our business is 800 years old. And I think that circular economy cannot happen unless we dare to disrupt our own businesses over and over again. So we employ some 26,000 people in more than 30 countries. Our value chains are very long. We sell to more than 70 countries globally. And in our value chain, we have converters, we have brand owners, we have retailers, and at the end, we have a consumer that has demands on what type of products they want to buy. And for us, I want to state it once again, it's been said many times before, but a precondition to succeed with circular economy is really to have open and fair trade. Without trade over the borders, we cannot make sure that the resources are allocated in the most efficient way and recycled in the most efficient way. So for us, this is fundamental. And open trade is a key to drive the economy away from fossil-based dependency and towards not only circular economy, but circular bio-based economy, where we reduce the use of fossil materials. And as I said, our value chains are long, they are complex. So how do we do this business disruption? Well, we believe that innovation can never happen in isolation. We need to work together with our suppliers and with our partners in the whole value chain to bring value to the consumers. And for us, we do that by saying that recycling is not enough. We also need to take the responsibility for replacing plastics and fossil-based materials with renewable materials whenever possible. And we believe that everything that is today based on fossil-based materials can be done by using tree fibers tomorrow. And by doing that, we help combat climate change, we help reforestation and build economies around forest management, which is important for the future. And today, what we see as barriers is that many companies are moving faster than actually the legislation is able to. We have global supply chains, so we can solve a lot of these challenges by new technology, but we need the governmental support and policy support to ensure that we take away as many trade barriers, hidden or non-hidden, that there are. That we make sure that we build up a collection and sorting systems that enable cost-efficient recycling where it's best fit. That we work with consumer awareness to make sure that consumers can make the right choices. We heard a little bit about subsidies in the wrong areas. Well, let's make sure that we use the powers of economic to kind of use that in order to drive the right behaviors that we want to see from consumers. And I would just like to finish with some examples of what we're doing in Stora Enso, is that we are working to design for circularity already in the beginning. When we discuss with brand owners and retailers, we tell them what is possible to do in order to make the products that we make easy to recycle, easy to take back. We want to have monolayer materials instead of complex structures. And for instance, we give second life to paper cups by taking away polyethylene barriers and replacing them with bio-based barriers to make them easily recyclable in our units. And we have invested a lot of money in recycling units over the years, so we know how to do this. And it's really encouraging to see that there are more businesses that now have to think about the same issues.
Really fascinating. Thank you for your interventions. Chang'e, would you want to give us your perspective, perhaps talking from your knowledge within China that has a relatively different system?
Sure. Thank you also actually for the invitation, and also congratulations to Citra, the organizer, actually, for putting such a great event together. So I've been sending through my social media, basically saying probably this is the world's largest get-together of circular economy. And together we have the opportunity to redesign something dramatic and transformative. So thank you very much for that. Since we're going to talk about challenges and opportunities there, so on the challenges side, I probably would highlight 3 challenges that I call inadequacy challenge, disruption challenge, and also reality challenge. We call it inadequacy as we're discussing here already. And so we see this gap between existing institution governance standards, expertise, and the aspiration actually to drive circular economy. And that is so obvious. And so we do not today have the right level of institution governance together for us to really leapfrog at this moment. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is disruptive. I think just like digital technology disrupting everything, actually, now I live in China, so I live in it, actually. So I think very similarly, I think thing will happen around the circular economy, because this is about materials, right? Material flow, material science. And we do have the opportunity. We have to literally, I use the 5 R's, like redefine, redesign, reshape, restructure, and reform, right? So everything will be redesigned. Actually, you could imagine, actually, the disruption that's going to happen, and we need to get ready, even from my side, the psychological perspective. And the third one I call reality challenge. I think the plastic, China issued a ban on plastic import, which triggered the ripple actually effect globally. I think it's one of the best things that China has done actually to accelerate sustainability for humanity at this moment. But when you deep dive into it, what is the nature of the issue? We do have laws, regulations, conventions available, as Karen mentioned early on, actually. So in many Western parts of the world, you do put garbages, in different bags, but in the end, you ship most of them actually to developing countries. If you look at the plastic in the ocean, I think the statistics tell some shocking story. Say, 5 countries from Asia contributed to most, 60% of the plastic in the ocean. So where do they come from, right? And in many cases, actually, they are shipped from western part of the world to developing countries, that particularly in Asia, in many countries, we do not have the, governance, expertise, capability, law enforcement, whatever, in the end, the plastic waste actually harmed local people's health, damaging the environment. In many cases, actually, they end up in the ocean. So that's the first reality. Second reality, on the positive side, China, and like many other countries, also has been implementing something called EPR, Enforced Producer's Responsibility. It's fascinating to see the steps, taken forward. But then coming down to reality, China manufactures for the rest of the world. So, of course, they are, sort of, we call like upstreams, either minerals mined from China or imported from other parts of the world. China is the world's largest iron ore importer. And then we produce products. In many cases, the products end up in many other parts of the world. And at the very end of the lifespan of this particular, like a mobile phone, whatever, you need to disassemble them, right? But we do have Basel conventions like that preventing the transboundary flow of materials because the convention said so. But now, actually, in order to scale up circular economy, we do need to go back to revisit existing laws, regulations, or governance mechanisms to see what's blocking, what should be changed. And the third reality, actually, is fascinating to see companies like Apple, a lot of cities in China now moving towards net zero waste cities, right? And here I heard yesterday, 100% circular. Right? It's fascinating to see the level of ambitions. But in reality, as I mentioned early on, if we do not address those barriers in reality, you could pretty much imagine we're not going to achieve the success or the level of ambition we said we're going to achieve, because we do need to redesign everything together. On the opportunities side, I think there are some very positive, optimistic signs that I will call like 5 vehicles, existing vehicles that we could ride on. The first one is really the trade regime. And China is advocating the reform of WTO, right? And that creates a huge opportunity to really integrate circular economy elements into the international trade regimes. And if you look at, we have regional trade blocks, we have bilateral. So this is the trade regimes that exist today that we could look into. That's the first vehicle. Second vehicle, I call like amend the existing environmental governance mechanisms. I mentioned the Basel Convention. And also, if you look at some climate change convention, biodiversity convention, and also, convention on combating desertification, when we adopted them back in 1992, they were treated as totally separate mechanisms. But today we know they're all really connected to each other. So there are issues like that. We need to deep dive, and we need to revise them. The third one, actually, I saw accelerate solution scaling by the leading economies. I think yesterday, colleagues from Japan, I think the minister mentioned something. Japan is chairing the G20 summit this year, and they made a decision that circular economy will become a very important agenda. That's fascinating. China has been driving a Belt and Road Initiative, and now it's called the Green Belt and Road Initiative. You could imagine circular economy has to be an important part of it. EU and China, on the bilateral front, we have this bilateral agreement on circular economy and climate change. Now we need, the two sides actually need to work together, really drive through the actions there. So the fourth vehicle I will call like connect the dots of innovation. There are many partners around the world today, advancing the agenda. P4G launched last year, which is fascinating. Look at the partnership, look at how the partnership innovation around the world that will be able to scale up solutions. I have the privilege to be involved in driving this smart green logisticity agenda there, and also there's another one around the circular economy project in China as well. The last one, actually, I would say drive the system change. I mentioned early on cities. Net zero cities, it seems to be becoming a campaign or norm of the day, which is fascinating. Cities offer this system for change. And the second innovation sort of system change actually is leading companies. As you mentioned early on, there are many companies like that because you have such vast value chain around the world. Multinational companies are very well positioned actually to drive the system change in reality. I would like to end, actually, to quote a friend of ours, actually, John Warner, American green chemist. Recently, actually, he went on a cruise expedition to investigate ocean plastics, It's about a 5 day. There are many people sort of on the ship talking about, plastic in the ocean. At the end of the day, actually, so his summary basically says it's fascinating to see the players, people on the ship, excitedly talking about their own innovations, right? Everyone seems to be doing lots of stuff, companies, countries, whatever. But what's missing in it is really connecting the dots, the whole ecosystem. Really understanding what are the real-life barriers blocking us together to accelerate the scaling part. I think maybe similar sort of a situation for us here to talk about the circular economy there. I think we heard a lot of exciting innovation here and many other parts of the world. It's fascinating. Those are the foundation of transformation, but somehow together we need to think about the system. System change needs we all working together. We need to redesign it. I think we have the biggest opportunity in our humanity to transform how we produce things, we consume things, and literally restructure a global industrial sort of landscape there. So it's fascinating to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's fascinating. I mean, you started, in a sense, by highlighting what we probably realize of the inadequacy gap. Where we are at the moment, we're kind of in the wrong place for the future, but we are where we are. And then at the end, you were talking about the exciting ambition of system change and being part of that. Just interested, Karen, from the point of view of a major business that gets it in terms of circular economy, just interested to explore a little further as to, in a sense, either you can just do your thing and work it out and get your business as fit for purpose and circular as possible. You can also be part of a global movement for change. And I'm just interested in the role of business as a thoughtful part of system change rather than just creating the conditions for your own business to further succeed in. And do we have that wider movement of change, and if not, where do we see those alliances beginning to really blossom so we can have those sorts of thoughtful conversations?
I think there is a lot of work going on. In our own company, for instance, we are engaged in the Ellen MacArthur Foundation New Plastics Economy Initiative. We are working with a lot of NGOs and branch organizations, and of course we are involving all our customers and suppliers in this change. And it's, as you say, you can't make it alone. Of course, we want to develop our own business, but at the same time, if we don't get collection systems, sorting systems, infrastructure allowing the trade of materials, if we don't get waste classified as a resource instead of just being waste, if we don't get political legislation and work together with local municipalities or the different countries that are involved in setting up this infrastructure, we will not succeed. So I want to come back to the ecosystem thinking. This is not something for just one crusader for their own business good. This is something that we do for the good of the society as a whole. And I'm personally very proud of being part of a company with an 800-year history. I want to continue for decades and decades more, and making sure that we are able to move to a circular bio-based economy, reducing fossil dependency, will mean that we will have to change certain types of jobs for new types of jobs, creating different types of business models, for instance, where services or where products are used more than once in their lifetime becomes a natural part of our business. So I very much agree that this is a partnership journey. Right. And we do a lot of that work. It's necessary.
Okay. I'm curious from you both, are you concerned that we are going to move towards a sort of two-tier world? I mean, we already see this in other areas, whether this is digital technology, whether it's manufacturing, and you've both talked about disruption. If large companies are driving the change, or big metropolises, what does that mean for the rest of the world? How do we play catch up? How do we have this ecosystems thinking you're talking about, when up to now we very much relied on individuals, right? Leaders within business, or often within business first, sometimes within the policy space, driving the change. How do we make sure that we take the whole world with us? Because, as the young people said to us yesterday, we cannot afford a two-tier system. So I wonder, from a sort of futures and innovation perspective and a corporate perspective, how do we make sure that we don't end up in a two-tier world?
Sure. I think colleague from India yesterday mentioned, I think from Development Alternatives mentioned the number. She said 2/3 of infrastructure in India has not been built yet, right? Of course, I think through her statement, she mentioned, of course, we cannot really follow the old way. We need to do, develop infrastructure in a new way. It's easy to say, but in reality, particularly around the infrastructure, technologies are mostly available today, even from material science perspective. Construction materials, they could be recycled. Maybe some parts of the world is already common practice. So there is a bigger issue, basically saying, okay, if we're serious about the urgency, for actions, the global community together, the destiny together, I think we need also to think about globally how to work together about technologies, expertise, talents there as well. If we continue to talk about IPR issues, the cost, if the cost is too high for developing countries actually to adopt the technology probably they do not have today, we're not going to move forward very fast at this moment. So that's the first point I want to add. Secondly, I think that there is still a lot of uncertainty. I had to say, bear the ignorance of our humanity. We know the material science is revolutionizing everything today. Circularity is a sort of in it at this moment. Digital technologies are coming on board that's transforming how we produce things, right? Rather than build up large industrial facilities in order to manufacturing products and goods, today distributed sort of models could be deployed in many developing parts of the world, even in the community, in the sort of village level. I think there is one example about Danone. The Danone produces dairy products. So in the past, they built large industrial facilities to do the manufacturing, then they sell to the market. Today, advanced manufacturing can pretty much already made a reality that they could build up much smaller facilities, processing facilities, literally located in some communities closest to the market. So there are things like that. So we do not have necessarily go towards this two-tiered, but rather to think about like distributed, really getting down to local community, even to the village level. On the material side, I think there's going to be a lot to be learned. What kind of materials we're going to use to provide some sort of products. I think that creates huge opportunities for talents, for expertise in developing countries, even indigenous knowledge, to think about it, innovation, new materials, entrepreneurship, things like that. But in order to do so, I think there's another level of, developed countries need to also help with expertise in developing countries in order to overcome this sort of divergence of the haves and have-nots.
Annika, would you like to add anything to that? I saw you nodding. I wondered if you...
No, I agree. And then, of course, as a company, in our case at least, we work with forestry and plantations. We have a lot of our businesses not in the big cities, but at the same time, we also harvest the forests of the cities, i.e. taking back the fibers that are consumed in a city and recycling them close to bigger cities. So, like you said, a lot of the companies are also reevaluating now what type of business models do they have, going from perhaps big centers to smaller, more closer to their markets. And that enables also the setup of new infrastructure. And I want also to say that the technology is there. It is not that we have to invent something. Small companies learn from those that have built successful models and copy. That is a very good step to move us forward. And then, of course, if governments can subsidize and support the right type of models, that, of course, also accelerates the pace.
I guess there we're then talking about the access to the IP, the intellectual property, to be able to harness these technologies, right? Because the technologies are already there. Our conversation is about challenges and opportunities. You've both talked to both. Overall, do you feel that there are more challenges that we need to overcome or opportunities when it comes to trade in raw materials and remanufactured goods? Where are you at the moment? Glass half full or empty?
I'm a little bit more towards the optimistic side, and particularly, coming from China, living in the sort of epicenter of innovation today, and circular economy is already a big agenda. Trade, all the pieces coming together in China. I think China offers a great opportunity to drive for a new model, but very importantly, it cannot be left to China itself. China has to work with the global community to really transform, grab the opportunity, and reshape, redefine a future that's going to be really sustainable.
And you, Annika?
I'm also optimistic. We have business in China. I see firsthand on the drive that is there that you're taking the lead in many of the areas. Also, we have business in Uruguay, and small countries can do a lot if they join forces. So I'm a little bit more pessimistic of some of the kind of developed countries and where they are moving, especially the other side of the Atlantic. I would hope that there would be some changes there, but.
Biggest euphemism of the morning, a country that shall remain nameless. Right, moving swiftly on. Would we like to thank you again? I think it's really important that we harness the optimism that is in the room, the optimism that is on the stage. It's rare that we are saying that actually we're looking to smaller countries and other centers of the world to lead on an agenda. And finally, perhaps, the circular economy is the space to have that. So I'm tempted to not ask you any more questions because I want us to sit with the sense of optimism that you have given us. So thank you to you both.
Can I just add one thing? Yeah, sorry. I do want to add one thing, actually. I think the EU-China partnership offers the biggest opportunity there as well. So, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, thank you for that. Okay.
And in our last section, we're going to just touch on the huge issue around trade agreements and how trade agreements can promote sustainable and circular trade. And delighted to welcome to the platform from the World Trade Organization, the Director of Trade and Environment Division, Eiko Lim, and also invite back to the platform Anthony Cox from OECD to offer us some perspectives on that. Good to welcome you here.
It's a little bit like first dates. We're just here checking out all the candidates in the circular economy and trade world. Right, let's see what you have to offer,
gentlemen. We're getting on fine.
I got a second date.
That's it, yes. Yeah.
Well, let's hope it's better than the first here. Let's improve.
What was wrong with the first?
No, just a sense of, okay, let me stop digging my own grave. Right. Thank you both again for coming back. Eiko, let's start with you, please. Your organization has been mentioned a few times already this morning. So are you losing any sleep over the idea of the need to reform the WTO? Where are you approaching the conversation around trade agreements and circular economy?
Okay, thanks very much, Eliza, and thanks very much, Peter. Let me try to pick up the conversation. I think a lot has already been said, and actually Anthony already did a very nice overview of the international trade linkages to the circular economy. Some very basic points, which repeating a little bit of what's been said, is that you can't really think about scaling up the circular economy without thinking about how do you mainstream international trade. That's true whether you're talking about circular economy or you're just talking about traditional economy, if you like. So the international trade part is very big. And as you all know, that part of it today is getting even bigger because of global value chains. And that's true also for the circular economy. So that's quite clear. The other part of the challenge is as we talk about mainstreaming international trade into circular economy, how do you mainstream circular economy into international trade? That's the other part of the challenge, as I see it, as a very sort of global nature. I will go a little bit deeper into some of the trade restrictions, but before doing so, on WTO reform, clearly this is a very important part of what we're looking at today at the WTO, of the multilateral trading system. The members are very engaged in a discussion, and proposals have been put up through the WTO on the reform that they would like to see. But much of this reform is about the structure of rules in terms of disputes, in terms of binding dispute settlement within the WTO. It does not touch per se on circular economy. Which brings me to another part of it, which is when we talk about WTO reform, I think we have to be mindful that the multilateral trading system, the WTO, is essentially the sum of its parts, and its parts are its members. So it's basically members' own national trade policies that, if I can say, would need to be reformed in order to support the circular economy. Because what's behind a trade agreement? Trade agreement at a multilateral level is an agreement which you get all of the members of WTO, currently it's 164, who negotiate based on their national positions, and they will negotiate on what they want to negotiate, what they want to remove, what they want to maintain. That is not determined by the rules. That's determined by the negotiations and the policies that the members bring to the table. So that part of reform, I think, is important to keep in mind. It's going to be nationally driven. It has to be nationally driven. They will have to decide what are their national interests and to what extent sustainability and circular economy fits into that national interest. In terms of the sort of more granular picture on trade challenges, some has already been mentioned. Definitions, classifications are very important. Everything that's traded today is based upon a system of classification. So in that system of classification, one will have to distinguish between what is waste, what is a secondary material, what is a secondary resource. And depending on how that is classified, you will be encountering different trade restrictions. You may even be encountering a ban completely, which will prohibit the product from entering the territory. So that type of work is a technical level work which requires agencies like the World Customs Organization to come on board. Another part of the issue is on standards. We heard today about standards being very important. WTO agreements basically strongly encourage, if not require, technical regulations to be based on international standards. But the WTO does not develop international standards. International standards are developed either through industry, working with international standards bodies. And that part of the puzzle would also need to come in. What is happening in the international standards world today as far as circular economy is concerned? Another area which I think is worth looking at, and this comes back to my earlier remark about national policies or national trade policies. Typical trade restrictions are tariffs or a large part of it, non-tariff barriers, which could be technical regulations, standards, conformity assessment procedures, etc. On tariffs, this is really determined by countries themselves. They have to decide for themselves what their tariff structure will be. What are they seeking to protect, or what are they seeking to liberalize? So that's an important part of the puzzle. We know today that tariffs on industrial goods are fairly low. They're about like 4% on average. But if you take into account global value chains, where intermediate goods are flowing across borders repeatedly, this may increase. And when we come to non-tariff barriers, I think I just make a quick link to services, which I haven't heard spoken about that much this morning. When we think about integrating circular economy into international trade and vice versa, trade in services is very important. It was on Anthony's slide. Because we already see a trend of growth in services trade. Moving towards services, and servicification seems to be quite key to the circular economy. On the other hand, international trade in services is full of restrictions. It's a heavily restricted area. So if you want to think about pushing circular economy based on the services model, one has to think again about what to do with services trade restrictions. Last point, subsidies. It's been mentioned a few occasions already. WTO essentially would agree that we move towards removing trade distortive subsidies, and WTO has an agreement on trade distortive subsidies. The question here becomes more about to what extent are members willing to come to the WTO and negotiate something like fossil fuel subsidy reduction. Currently, there are ongoing negotiations on fisheries subsidies, somewhat of a similar logic, But that was agreed through the SDGs, and the hope is that we will achieve something, a result by the end of this year on fisheries subsidies. So and that subsidy issue, because of the competitiveness element that was mentioned by the World Bank, is not something you can do easily bilaterally, regionally, or plurilaterally. It really requires a multilateral deal. So there are certain elements here which you can use trade agreements to leverage for the circular economy, but the ability to do so requires the uptake of circular economy through national governments, through their national policies, and through their national trade perspective, and to bring that to the WTO.
Thank you so much for that. I wonder if, because we've already had a first go-around, maybe I should just put a question, if you don't mind, Anthony, straight to ECHO, because Changhua was talking earlier about the challenges, the perception challenge, and I wonder if you felt that there is that multilateralism is having a bit of a perception challenge at the moment, that people don't perceive it as being of value, that what is of importance is what's happening solely at the national level of establishing country authority. How do we change this perception so that people can come back to the multilateral table, especially as you've just said, that what we need cannot happen at any other level but at the multilateral?
I think it depends on whom you're speaking to and where you're getting that perspective from. I mean, currently, what we see is actually very strong support for multilateralism. But on the other side of the coin, I think it's also fair to say that trade and trade policy is not going to be a silver bullet. You're not going to solve all issues through trade policy. And perhaps on that aspect, there has been not enough thinking and work on about how do we use other flanking policies to support trade policy. It was mentioned this morning that there will be winners and losers from an adjustment towards circular economy, for instance. In these winners and losers, there will need to be a social readjustment. Social policies will need to kick in. And that part of the equation, I think it's fair to say that multilateral trade would need to find a way to bring more of these sorts of issues of inclusion into the table or back onto the table.
Thank you.
Anthony, I wonder, you set the ball rolling this morning, and particularly around this thorny issue around trade agreements, whether you've just got one or two observations from OECD about the pathway forwards here.
Sure, thanks, Peter. And I think it's really, I'd just like to thank Citra for putting trade on the agenda today, because I think it's one of the trickiest issues that we're going to have to confront. And it's also one of the most boring issues we have to confront. You get into
No.
Oh, I'm afraid so. We get into the nitty-gritty of customs detail, of customs regulations and defining stuff. And we heard this morning and yesterday a call for more harmonisation of standards. And the challenge I see there is that I think there is a bit of a headwind against such harmonisation. We see sorry, but I think there is a bit of a headwind against multilateralism at this stage. There's a reluctance to engage in finishing the Doha round. We're seeing a growth of regional trade agreements rather than pure multilateral trade agreements. Domestically, there's a big deregulation agenda in most of our countries that is trying to cut environmental red tape, or green tape. Come to those people and say, hey, listen, we want to harmonise everything. We want to get everything in line, want to get our ducks in line so we have a circular economy. You know what's going to happen there. So in terms of trying to drive that push towards harmonization, which we do need, we do not want a multiplicity of standards and regulations out there that'll hinder trade. We want to have some form of harmonization. This has to come from the grassroots. It has to be demanded by business. It has to be driven by businesses saying, we want to make profit by being in the circular economy business. We want to ensure that we can trade across our global value chains in a way that is sustainable, and we need standards, definitions, regulations to support that. And new governments have to drive that. Businesses have to partner with groups such as the OECD or UNEP that can help facilitate that interaction between policymakers and business, and it needs to do that very quickly. The holy grail for environment ministries is to get in the room with finance ministers. That's been the big objective of every environment ministerial meeting I've been to. Say, gee, if only we had finance ministers in the room. I think the next holy grail for the environment ministers is to get in the room with trade ministers so they can impress upon them the need to have a multilateral trade system that is supportive of the circular economy.
I just want to... There's something that's been leaving me slightly uncomfortable here, and maybe you can help me or not. This whole business of international trade, I kind of get it. Goods and stuff is whizzing around the world in ships and boats and things, and my pet food comes from some far corner of something, and then I send a can back across the world. I just wonder, fundamentally, rather than thinking about international trade, and how does circular economy work within international trade, if I start from circular economy and say, keep it small, keep it simple, keep it local, keep the value as far as possible, how can I have well-being without having to deploy resources from around the globe? Is there a new conversation that has to be had about simplicity in a circular economy rather than extraordinary complexity in new multilateral agreements, or am I just sitting on the wrong raft here?
No, I don't think you're sitting on the wrong raft, but I think it's clear that we need both. We need to have a recognition that circular economy is an ecosystem, and humans and societies in their striving for increasing well-being and prosperity clearly look for the local. There's a big trend towards going local, but we have to recognise that that's part of a broader ecosystem. Individuals don't necessarily have the bandwidth to be able to think in those big systems. That's why you've got groups like the WTO, the OECD, to help with those platforms that'll facilitate that so that well-being can be enhanced at the local level by individuals.
Do you want to...
Maybe there was a comment made by Elliot Harris from the UN yesterday, where he was reflecting on the fact that, smaller countries, smaller markets have difficulty in driving circular economy models without linking up to the global market in international trade. And I think that's quite an important part of an answer to your question. And that logic is true for international trade in general. The larger the market, the bigger the size of your market, in effect, the less you need international trade. That's true. You have economies of scale that you can drive up through a very large market. International trade has often tended to be an instrument that is very much needed by smaller markets, smaller players, to create the economy of scale. And then when it comes to trade agreements, for instance, the WTO, and I agree with you, there's strong headwinds on multilateralism, but I'm trying to be optimistic, is that the multilateral trade agreement essentially is trying to create the rules of play, if you like. How do you engage in international trade? It's never going to be a perfect system. There are always going to be trade disputes, trade frictions, and I'm sure there will be trade frictions emerging in circular economy. And because of that, you do need a multilateral trade system to find a way to settle such disputes. And that's really the purpose, in my view, of the whole system here. If we look at it at two levels, it's the rules that allow you to engage in international trade is on the one hand, and then the other part of it is the actual liberalization agenda of what goods and services. So these are the two things that can support circular economy. And back to your local versus global, it really depends on the size of your market. Even for very large markets, I don't think it's a good way to go just local. But certainly, small players will have a great difficulty in doing so.
Well, you both have the honor and the privilege to be the ones to close us out on this really meaty subject. There's so much that we have to cover, and there's a sense that while there are gains, there are also losses, there are also headwinds. What would you say then to our audience, many of whom you have described as, the grassroots, the people, the businesses here that can actually push change? What would you say to them as, if we want to make sure that trade and circular economy work together in both directions, as you've talked about, what is the one thing that these people here need to start thinking about?
I would say simply that all that you're saying to me and to each other today has to go to your trade negotiators. These are the people who will need to listen to what you are telling us today, that you want to see more circular economy models into international trade. So it's about essentially making this concept more social awareness about it, but more important than that, it's to direct it to the trade delegations, trade ministries, because these are the people who will, at the end of the day, negotiate the trade agreements for you. So they need to hear what you are saying.
And you, Anthony?
I would thoroughly agree. Your voices have to go up the chain to politicians, to the trade negotiators, to the policymakers. It has to be clear that we cannot pull up the drawbridge and live in a world of autarky. Trade is here to be an assistance, a boon to the circular economy, but we need to make it work for the circular economy and not against it.
Right. Well, Ekulim and Anthony Cox, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts, and also thank you to our other speakers this morning. We hope you've been stimulated very much by this session. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And Eliza, it's been great to have been on a first date. We may never meet again, but who knows?
Didn't
some
even
platform.
Get a drink. What a cheap
yeah. But we now have half an hour for refreshments, and then you have a mélange of interesting topics in the parallel sessions. So enjoy the conversation, enjoy the refreshments, and we'll see you later. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you all. Thank you.